So let me. So, dear colleagues, let me welcome you on behalf of Steinar Bryn from the Nansen Academy and Harald Weinberg from the Cultures Interactive, who are the two co-organizers of this event and our partners in launching our initiative for institutionalization of dialogue, which we have launched 1 year, one and a half year ago. Under institutionalization, as you know, you may know, we mean to establish a structure for dialogue, a so-called dialogue room. This will want to include such dialogue rooms in the decision-making mechanisms of international institutions and also in the national capacity building. And we also would like, within this framework, to develop national capabilities of dialogue at all levels and in all ages of populations. So with the view to drive this process, the implementation of the initiative, we established the so-called Alliance for Dialogue together with Steinar and Harald, which will act or acts on voluntary basis as an open-ended movement. And over time, we plan to transform it into a legal entity. For the time being, it is hosted by the Budapest Center for Dialogue and Methods Prevention. And you can find some details if you will just click on our website, or you can just contact me, and then I will help you to clear any questions. You are also kindly requested to support our initiative, which we have launched by a petition, and you can just sign up to it. And obviously, if any political or other supports you have, then please don't hesitate to provide it. For the time being, we focus our efforts on making some so-called test drive, where we would like to establish one dialogue room within the framework of one international institution, where the partners will focus diverse views on some horizontal or geographical challenges. And should you be in the position to help us in organizing such a dialogue room, we shall also appreciate your assistance. As you may know, part of our initiative is to raise awareness of the benefits of dialogue. And we obviously will want to speak about the benefits of dialogue, but we do not want to hide either that there are a lot of difficulties in organizing, convening dialogues, and also there are a lot of uncertainties of the outcome of dialogue. Therefore, we do not want to so-called sell the idea of dialogue. We think we want to speak with you, and we want to talk with you about the benefits of dialogue and about its implementation. So we want to make this idea as tangible as possible, and therefore we organize these this series of webinars, including our current webinar, where we intend to present the challenges of dialogue in the case of the most complex conflicts in the globe. Namely, this is one of the most complex conflicts is the Russian aggression in Ukraine and its implication on the internal peace in Ukraine. As you may know, history clearly shows that wars generate enormous tensions and conflicts within the populations. Therefore, reconciliation and peace demand extra and consistent efforts. So we, as proponents of this initiative, instead of ad hoc efforts, we also prefer to transform our idea into action also in Ukraine. As it stands in the title of our event, we reflect on dialogue in terms of long-term peace and stability in Ukraine. And the current trends are featured by, unfortunately, I must say, at least in my view, unfortunately, by the so-called transactional activities which are rooted in bilateral negotiations that prioritize interests through pressure, while these efforts disregard values. So this approach, in my view, in our views, leads only to short-term solution, if at all. And also the current state of play in the peace mediation led by President Trump looks rather vague, given that the final offer for peace of President Trump also was rejected by Zelensky just yesterday. On our side, we are convinced that in long term, peace and stability could be achieved through including all concerned parties in the peace process, and during this process, where the timeless principles of values, laws, dialogue, and multilateralism are applied as this methodology, because this methodology preserved peace in Europe for the past 80 years. Therefore, we also argue for opening the doors of negotiations for all concerned parties, including the European Union. And we want that it will be agreed, the peace settlement in a multilateral framework, which will be featured by dialogue, where the controversial views could be expressed on equal basis and also could and must be heard by all participants. I don't want to go into any further details because our distinguished panelists today will for sure share highly valuable information, knowledge, and expertise with you, and it will help us in further developing our views and approaches. Our event is planned as usually to be rather interactive. We wish to provide space for questions and answers, where you may ask for the views of our experts. And I wish to also underline that our current event is about providing space for open reflections. So please don't hesitate to share with us your views on how dialogue capacities in Ukraine could be further developed. In spite of the ongoing war, we are convinced that dialogue cannot be started early enough. Therefore, we would encourage all partners and all people to engage in dialogue with each other, and also to develop these capacities in Ukraine. So, according to our schedule, each panelist will present the main views during the first half of our webinar, and this second half of our webinar will be dedicated to questions and answers. And if you don't mind, I will start the panel with our first panelist, who is Giulia Palmiano Federer from the Center for Security Studies. And she will share some experience in the merits and chances of inclusive peace and dialogue in armed conflicts. So we shall start with a wider focus and dimension. As you may know, Giulia is a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies in Zurich. And she is leading now a book project on process design for peace mediation as part of the CSS Mediation and Peace Promotion Cluster. Her research interests center around innovative and critical approaches to peace mediation and conflict resolution, including the role of norms in peace mediation, the role of non-governmental organizations producing knowledge and expertise on peacemaking, as well as she researches the impact of track 2, the unofficial dialogue on questions of inclusion and effectiveness, and the indigenous and non-indigenous ethical knowledge exchange on mediation and peacemaking. I hope my welcome words have not been too long, but right now the floor is yours, Giulia.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone, and I'm happy to be here and privileged to be here. So let me know if you can't see the slides or if my volume is too low, but we'll go from here. So what has been said, I'm Dr. Julia Palmiano Federer, and I wanted to just take a moment to maybe frame the themes of dialogue, inclusion, vis-a-vis peace, mediation, vis-a-vis conflict. My background is not particular to Ukraine. So I will let my other distinguished panelists speak directly to this context, but I wanted to share what these words bring to bear based on academic research and practice to the extent possible. And so I wanted to share some of the ongoing research that I've been a part of, and that might be related and useful to the notion of dialogue. And I mean, I imagine with all of you being here, you have various understandings and views on dialogue. But I mean, basically, to set the stage, if the idea of dialogue is a form of two-way communication as a form of conflict resolution or transformation or management or what have you, fully understanding that all of these terms are very sensitive and political. But I think if we understand dialogue of transforming relationships and going beyond zero-sum decision making, trying to find some semblance of future-oriented problem solving, then we can be on the same page there. And then once you square this concept of inclusive dialogue in peace processes, what does that actually mean? So my research I conducted in Switzerland, working at Swiss Peace for a long time. I've worked at the Ottawa Dialogue, and a lot of this research comes out of my time there working with people like Josh Nadeau and Dr. Peter Jones, Dr. Tatiana Kiselova here in this call. But we were really looking at the questions of, well, what does inclusive dialogue mean? What does it manifest as? And what are the benefits, if at all, and what are the challenges? I did my doctoral work on looking at this norm of inclusion in mediation processes, and the United Nations has come out has come out with a so-called guidance for effective mediation of 2000 and 2012, and really listed inclusivity as a key sort of normative fundamental alongside of consent, alongside of impartiality. And it was interesting. So my colleagues and I really looked at this growing normative framework around this imperative for mediation, dialogue, peace processes to be inclusive. And I'm just framing this as not, inclusion per se as being, of course, it's important, but what are the actual impacts on processes? And this research had really come out from this guide that you'll see here, and you can see it online. But we found that there was an increasing imperative to make processes more inclusive. So we did some research on this and found that the whole normative framework of peace mediation and peace processes, it wasn't mediators and peace process actors were being faced with this ethical dilemma of really, are we here to mediate and broker a ceasefire and stop violence, or are we using this opportunity to also redefine the idea of society and addressing the root causes of conflict in the first place, which often has to do with certain aspects of society feeling excluded. And then you also basically saw in sort of the design of dialogue processes around different conflict contexts, so really protracted ones from Colombia to the Philippines to Sudan and many others, this idea of, well, there's this normative imperative of you just need to include society to address root causes, and a really pragmatist argument of, well, what does it actually mean? Then if you try to include civil society, if you try to include, let's say, women and other non-armed actors, what does that mean for the effectiveness of getting to a peace agreement? So we really grappled with this idea there. And also just so that you know kind of where we're coming from, we mentioned track two, and many of you might be very familiar with this, some of you not. So this is a rendering of track two from Dr. Jones's work, who's really built off researchers like Lederach and Chigas. But this idea that dialogues and peace initiatives can take place along different tracks, and really focuses on the idea of unofficial dialogues or dialogues taking place in an informal capacity, so at track two. So you can kind of organize inclusion this way. And we've done a lot of research on seeing that this idea of, well, if you have track two and track three dialogues, vis-a-vis an official track one at the top of a pyramid. So if you see track one being official negotiations between government representatives, so Trump, Zelensky, Putin at this level, to speak to the Ukrainian context, you have a whole ecosystem of track one and a half, track two processes where you have official or unofficial talks taking place, and then track three, which is where scholars are kind of it's contested, but this idea that you have a larger kind of societal level tracks taking place. How do you make these inclusive? And are these tracks kind of vehicles for inclusion? And essentially, I mean, and I'm happy to follow up with, there's a really big set of research here that I'm trying to get to. So research, this is Tanya Pfaffenholz's Modalities of Inclusion. So whether you think about inclusive dialogues on tracks, at the level of tracks, or if you think about them as modalities, ranging from, if you see number one, direct representation, all the way to mass action, they sort of follow this pattern. What we're kind of seeing in the research world now, and I'm just going to do a shameless plug for research around inclusive dialogues, and Dr. Peter Jones and Dr. Tatiana Kiselova are part of this research, is looking at sort of inclusive dialogues as sort of messier than that. Do they take place alongside? They don't take place necessarily on these kind of neat tracks, but they're kind of made up as a patchwork. And you can see some of the articles that it's just come out last month, and we're really looking at this and applying this to different contexts. What might be interesting for this group is that we have one paper looking, for example, at the civil society support room in the Syrian context, maybe somewhat speaking to the notion of a dialogue room where you really had civil society actors in a physical room kind of feeding in the results of track two dialogues taking place directly to the formal talks. So there's a lot of research that's developing out there. And because there's really no time, this is just kind of a way to set the stage. I wanted to talk about, well, what can dialogues do before any peace agreement and maybe after, and what does that bring to bear? So my last kind of couple slides, there is a really big project that is taking place that my colleagues and I at the Ottawa Dialogue were part of, that was run out of Harvard. And it was the idea of, they wanted to look at why peace agreements happened, even in the most protracted, more than 20 years of conflicts, even in the most asymmetrical, and even the most ethno-nationalist context. So we looked at 11 different cases, 3 years of research, et cetera. My team with Dr. Peter Jones and others, we looked at the role of track two, and so unofficial dialogues, and how in all these peace agreements that actually took place between 1948 and now, what did track two actually do, if anything? And we come out in this paper that we're working on is coming out in the next month or so, but I think it's just important to know that unofficial dialogues can play a lot of different roles that are unseen, right? And then you often won't see it. And I just wanted to point out two that might be two functions that you see here on this rendering of a visual of the role and functions unofficial dialogues can take place before an agreement is signed. It can really be basically, if you look at the lower left, a form of life support in kind of the most kind of protracted conflicts where you don't see any space per se. It can just be a way of keeping the prospect of some sort of future thinking open. Or if there is an opening for peace process support, et cetera, it might do a lot of heavy lifting. So we just wanted to make a point of, it might not look the same depending on the context, but then there is a role for unofficial dialogues. After an agreement, and that can actually lead to an agreement and help towards an agreement, not be the sole cause of leading to a peace agreement, but helping. And then lastly, I just wanted to say there is a really big empirical trend of looking at the role of inclusion and inclusive dialogue spaces linking to the durability of a peace agreement. And this is quite powerful because it looks at, for people that are interested, well, empirically, how does this work? This is a really big research paper that came out in 2012. And Dr. Nilsson really makes the argument, and she does this statistically, looking at a number of case studies, that there is a statistical connection between the inclusion of civil society actors and the durability of a peace agreement. And she actually says that this kind of positive and statistically significant effect is even more important in a non-democratic space. And so I'm happy to speak about this or encourage you to read this article. And then particularly in terms of inclusion, there is another article that's widely cited that came out a few years ago that's making the same empirical link, this time between women's participation in actual dialogue spaces leading to peace negotiations and the durability of peace. And there's a number of ways they measured the durability of peace that we can also question and talk about, but it's related to the kind of lack of return to armed conflict after peace negotiation, or kind of the institutionalization of democratic structures. And then I'm running out of time, but this is basically, they also like a rendering. It's very graphy, but it basically shows that the more women that you actually had when they measure as women signatories, the more durable the implementation of these peace agreements were. So it's really interesting research. And then I think just to kind of give you all a sense of what is also happening beyond the numbers, beyond the kind of functions. I'm part of a research project with my Swiss Peace colleagues that's really looking at, well, what happens after a peace agreement? Do dialogues matter? And we're doing, this time from the other end of sort of the research spectrum, a feminist sort of critical study on dialogues after peace. So we're looking at 3 contexts that have had so-called beautiful peace agreements. Kosovo, you can, maybe Kosovo not. It's much more complicated than that. And we're looking at, well, what do dialogues look like? And we're finding that women Track 2 led or unofficial dialogues have been really important in the implementation of sort of societal relations that are keeping people, whether they're victims of armed conflict in Colombia or indigenous groups in the Philippines, or just people in kind of majority urban spaces on track with, well, with how's implementation going. And this has been super important in the sustaining of a peace agreement. So that's my time. And I just wanted to thank you all for this very broad overview of what dialogue can bring to bear before a peace agreement, during a peace agreement, and after a peace agreement, even in the most difficult of settings. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for you as well, Julia. And after this rather broad dimension, let's start focusing on Ukraine, and let us start with the past, where with the lessons learned from the Minsk negotiation process between 2014 and 2021. And this information, this experience will be shared by Tatiana Kiselyova, who is the director of the Mediation and Dialogue Research Center in Kiev, Mohila Academy. She is also a director of the Mediation and Dialogue Research Center. She is a certified mediator. She was certified as a mediator by the Search for Common Ground and as a business mediator by the IHK Academy for Munich and Upper Bavaria. She's been working with civil society and the professional community of mediators in Ukraine since the 90s, and she's advising them on strategies of peace building, professional regulation, training, and methodologies of mediation and dialogue. So thank you very much, Tatiana, that you are with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well? Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here among colleagues, and I will focus today on the lessons of Minsk negotiations between 2014 and 2022, specifically in terms of inclusion of civil society. And my presentation is based on research that I published as an article in this special issue, which was co-edited by Julia. So I put the link to the full article, it's in open access, in the chat. So feel free to go and to read. And also the whole special issue is great, I think. Now focusing on the Minsk negotiations between Ukraine and Russia after Russia illegally annexed Crimea back in 2014. I would like to say that generally inclusion into this process went terribly wrong for many reasons, and one of the 6 lessons that I want to share with you now is that toxic and wrong process cannot be remedied by inclusion of civil society. And as Julia said, there is a lot of research how positive inclusion worked in those instances where you actually had peace agreements, and particularly in those very successful cases like Colombia or Philippines. But in those cases where the process was failed, and at some point some actors wanted to remedy the process by inclusion of civil society, this actually works wrong, at least in the Minsk process. I didn't do comparative research. I only focused on Minsk. And the problem of Minsk was that the whole process was handicapped and captured by Russia. And OSCE, as a mediator, had very weak mandate. OSCE is a consensus-based organization where both Ukraine and Russia had veto powers. And due to this nature, OSCE representatives were not really able to lead the process. And it turned out that it was Russia who was imposing their own understanding of process, and they manipulated with their roles. Instead of OSCE, Russia actually pretended to be mediators. And in Minsk, again, instead of talking directly to Ukraine, Russia would put representatives of proxy republics in their place and make Ukrainian government talk to proxies rather than to Russian government. So the process itself was really toxic. And I argue in my article that it has intoxicated the inclusion of civil society as well. And now, if we go to lesson number 2, it is important to understand that in interstate contexts, many traditional peace-making techniques, including dialogue and inclusion, work differently. And if I refer to what Julia introduced in her presentation, for example, the Ledrak pyramid. It makes complete sense when you talk about civil wars, when the conflict is between, in essence, the government and the people. And then you can put all those tracks into one triangle, into one pyramid. When you look at conflict between 2 states, you actually need 3 dimensions. You need 3 triangles. Because there is a geopolitical dimension of the triangle, but then there are also intra-country dimension of triangles. And for example, as I understand, Natalia Beshlipna will speak about intra-Ukrainian dialogue processes and how they work. I'm speaking about geopolitical process, Minsk negotiations. And when you have two parties who are both independent states, it is then logical to have civil society from both states. That basically means you need civil society both from Ukraine and Russia. Otherwise, if you only try to bring in civil society of one country, you impose extra burden on one party, but not on the other. And the other aspect of interstate conflict is that civil society in this configuration of conflict cannot de facto, and I also argue should not have independent agency at the negotiation table. Why? Because the conflict is between two different states, not between civil society and the state. That doesn't mean civil society doesn't have a word in the whole process. That's not true. In Ukraine, as a democratic state, civil society has a lot to say. And President Zelensky is actually one of very few Ukrainian presidents who was elected because he feels the people, and he continues to do so. So, and when we talk about interstate conflict, we cannot rule out that society and the government are aligned. And this is exactly the case of Ukraine. This is actually Kremlin propaganda that Zelensky wants to continue war, and Ukrainian people want to settle down immediately, and they don't care. There is a lot of research, and we have done a meta-study of Ukrainian opinion polls and civil society statements. There is still quite a lot of unity in Ukraine in respect to how this war should be ended. And at the moment, we still see a lot of unity between president and civil society and Ukrainian people. In this case, Putin civil society at the negotiation table at track one doesn't make any sense. And in principle, no one would think how civil society can end up in negotiations with Trump. It's just impossible. Yeah, because again, the process is so toxic and is so wrong that having civil society there is unimaginable. So what I argue is that instead of pushing for civil society at the negotiation table, which is both impossible and harmful, we should include civil society in all those 7 or more than 10 indirect modalities. The third lesson from the Minsk is that there is a huge asymmetry between civil society in Russia and Ukraine. In Ukraine, civil society is huge, 250,000 registered civil society organizations before 2022. In Russia, there is basically no independent civil society which would have any influence. If there was something, they left the country, and they have now very active diaspora, but not inside the Russia. So this particular lesson also speaks at the speaks towards the indirect modality of inclusion, civil society on the side of the government. The fourth lesson is that in the specific configuration of interstate conflicts, there is a huge problem about occupied territories. And we know that people who are most affected by the war are those who live at the front line territories or at the territories which were occupied by Russia. And in this case, that was exactly the problem in Minsk, because all the parties could not decide which civil society represent people of Donetsk and Lugansk occupied areas. So there was a contest between Ukraine and the so-called republics as to which civil society represents people from occupied territories. And given that we know how Russia manipulates any instrument, it's also quite easy to understand that they will do the same manipulations with people from occupied territories. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is no answer to this question. What Ukrainian civil society is trying to do, they're trying to do a lot of research on how Ukrainian people feel at the occupied territories, and in this indirect way try to bring their voices to the attention of our own Ukrainian government, but also internationally. Finally, another and last lesson and my argument towards indirect inclusion of civil society, meaning not at the negotiation table, is that a lot of people actually think that so far Ukrainian civil society was not included into peace process, whatever you call those processes that were since 2022, but it's actually not the case. We have done another case study of civil society inclusion into President Zelensky peace formula, and there was a remarkable inclusion of expert civil society into this process. It wasn't public, but actually, because the expertise on foreign policy lies very much with Ukrainian civil society, they were the people who prepared documents for the peace formula and just gave it to officials and to Zelensky. So things are working much better than we imagine, and there are many ways to improve the process. I should stop here.
Yes, thank you very much, Tatiana, for your very interesting presentation of the past, which also relates to the present and is valid for the present. And right now, let me give the floor to Natalia Beshlibna, who is actually a dialogue practitioner working together with many other dialogue practitioners in Ukraine. She will also speak about the current situation and possibilities of dialogue. She is a dialogue facilitator, mediator, and also a conflict resolution advisor. She's the head of the Secretariat of the Ukrainian Community of Dialogue Practitioners. And she also leads now a number of projects in Ukraine in the fields of conflict transformation, social cohesion, and peace building. She has experience working across all tracks of diplomacy in Ukraine, whereas her primary focus is on grassroots projects since the start of this full-scale invasions of the Russians. So, Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tatar, and thank you, distinguished colleagues and panelists. I will now switch our focus to Ukraine and to intrastate issues. And also, as Tatar already mentioned, I'm a practitioner, so I'm not a researcher. And I will show you a few slides, and whatever you will see on those slides is based on my experience and on my views, and of course based on the practice that we have, not only after 2022, after the full-scale invasion, but before that as well. And my topic today, let me share the screen. So my topic today is, you may see it on the screen, and basically it's about what and between whom the dialogue is needed in Ukraine. Now means in war times and post-war times. And before we will dig deeper into this presentation and into groups and topics, what I wanted also to add is a bit of context. I'm sure that since you are attending this event, you are quite aware about general Ukrainian context, but in my topic, there are few emphases that will really matter before we will go deeper into key players and key topics. So first is that current war, of course, that initiated by Russia against Ukraine, and started from 2014, because for us war started 2014. And we already, as a society, experienced quite a lot of implications, meaning that not only parts of the territories were occupied, but there were, of course, people who remained on occupied territories, who took different positions towards this occupation, and also there were first quite high wave of IDPs, internally displaced persons, and that already started to have its impact on Ukrainian society, because going a bit further, we have quite a big country and quite a diverse country, and there are different Ukrainians, different approaches, mindsets, and the IDPs, it was first experience for independent Ukraine, and that was quite unexpected, and then society need to somehow digest these implications. Next, after the full-scale invasion from 2022, of course, we had huge additional implications for the society, because the wave of IDPs was much higher, and the mobilization of population was also a pretty higher, like, if I may say so, comparing to 2014. And now we have, we are living in this situation when we have changes that we are experiencing from 2022, and they are still more and more, but generally the situation is that we as a society have very different experiences of living through war, started in 2014 and from 2022, because there are people who stayed in Ukraine and who fled. There are people who went to the war and those who don't want to do this. There are people who volunteered and who didn't. There are people who try to live like war is not happening, and there are people who do everything every day to somehow make their impact in making peace possible. So there are different experiences, and we as society we still have like one common society, and we need somehow to digest these experiences. And as I already said, we are quite diverse country. We have 24 oblasts, like regions, and people from these regions have different traditions, mindsets, approaches, sometimes religion. So we need to this is a context that we as dialogue facilitators work in. And a few figures. I will not give you my hand that it's like totally they're totally like that. These figures are double checked from different sources, but for what I found for now is that approximately the figures are the following: that so-called old diaspora, so those Ukrainians who left Ukraine, ethnical Ukrainians who lived outside of Ukraine as for beginning of full-scale invasion is around 27 million people. So-called new diaspora, those people, those Ukrainians who moved outside of Ukraine is around 6.8 million people. And this abbreviation GCA, government control areas of Ukraine. Now, also there are different approximations, but that one that I found saying it's around 33 million of people now living in Ukraine on government control areas. So just very easy arithmetic shows you that there are quite similar figures of Ukrainian living outside of Ukraine now and living inside of Ukraine on government control areas. And definitions for this presentation talking about wartime and post-war times, because it's very vague definition. And so only for this for the purposes of this presentation, please consider that wartime, I've been thinking about the context or about the current context. So some topics and some key groups, there is some dynamic, but my approach was that it will be about this time around year around, so 2024, 2025. And of course, it's about active phase of war. And when you will see the slide about post-war times, because we all know that ceasefire is not equal to peace agreement, and after peace agreement, you still have different issues to handle. So, but what I see is that post-war times is, at least after ceasefire, we will see whether we eventually will see ceasefire and peace deal 2 and 1. I'm not sure, personal my opinion. But this post-war times, it's after the active phase of war on the way to sustainable peace, and it's what is usually called transitional justice period. And I will also make a reservation here that for Ukraine and Ukrainian situation, it seems that this transitional justice concept also need to be reshaped because so-called traditional approaches to transitional justice might not work well for Ukraine. So going into topics and groups. So if we talk about wartime, there are key groups in Ukrainian society. Of course, I haven't had a chance to put on one slide all groups, but I mentioned those between that are mostly, like, you may see them very well when you work with Ukrainian society, and there are those groups that should be definitely involved in dialogues in Ukraine, intra-Ukrainian dialogues. So first group, of course, is civilians and veterans, or those people who are still in military, because from time to time they're not spending all their time at the front line or in military service. At military service, they quite often may interact with civilians, so that's this group. And also there is a group very diverse, because they all have different experience of families, of militaries, of veterans, of those missed in actions, and unfortunately killed. So those are different groups, and we see that they have different needs, and based on this, they have the portion of common not understanding of each other, and that brings the need for dialogue. And then the other key groups is locals and IDPs, those from 2014 and those from 2022. And sometimes, luckily, it's not that widespread, but also what we experienced in our work is that sometimes even dialogues between IDPs from 2014 and IDPs from 2022 might be well needed, because those people have also very different experience, and sometimes they don't understand each other, because some people, like some IDPs, think that life is much easier for other group IDPs. That is also quite often is not what reality is. And then, of course, there are Ukrainians from government control areas and from liberated territories, those that were occupied and then liberated. And talking about liberated territories, we have different, We have liberated territories around Kiev, for instance, that were occupied. I think you all heard about these atrocities in Bucha, Irpin, and other small cities or villages around Kiev. And these territories were occupied for around a month. However, there are other territories that were occupied. Some of them were occupied in 2014, and then the others were occupied in 2022. And there are different experiences of people living through on these territories who stayed there because they wanted or because they didn't have other choice. But the experience of structured violence from Russians is very different, and people who are staying in government control areas and those people from liberated territories also have a lot of stuff to discuss. I will tell more about when talking about essential topics. And I see the time, and so I will try to maybe to speak faster if it's possible. So then we are talking about Ukrainians from also from occupied territories, and Tatiana already said that we as a society, of course, see a big need to keep this dialogue, and then because the next phase it will be about reintegration of them, and we all very interested in that people who are really willing to get back, have a possibility to get back and feel themselves part of Ukrainian society. Also, there is a language issue about Ukrainian speaking, Russian speaking Ukrainians. Luckily, this problem is not that acute now. However, sometimes I see that the need for dialogue is still there because people have their ideas and needs behind this. And Ukrainians in Ukraine and Ukrainians abroad. So I already showed you figures about old diaspora and new diaspora. And then last but not the least, government and civil society. I totally support what Tatiana said with regard to the alignment of civil society and our government in regard to the red lines of the negotiation and general approach. However, there are still quite a lot of stuff to be discussed between government and civil society. And talking about topics, I will not go through all of them. You can see them on slide. I will just focus on few, and here you can see that what is the vision of victory and peace for Ukrainians, and that is a topic that is actually widely needed to be discussed. However, unfortunately, there are no systematic discourse around this, and that is the one that, of course, need to be within civil society and between government and civil society. And also a very important topic is request for justice, because for people who somehow who have this experience of occupation, and they, like, even in one village, people will have very different experience of living through occupation, and their request for justice will be not only with regard to the Russians, but with regard to those people who were around and how they interact during this occupation. So the issue of collaborationism, and also the issue of how the village that survived occupation will manage itself after all who might be because collaborationism is a legal matter. So we have a law according to which it's criminally pursued and so on. But the question is still there. If half of the village might be pursued for collaborationism according to the law, and then you will have half of the village in prison, whether the rest of half of the village will be happy with this, and whether the village will be capable to survive, actually having like half of its population. So there are still a lot of stuff to be discussed, and I will very shortly go through these key groups and essential topics during the period of transitional justice. So there are some groups of civilians. However, you see that there are veterans, because hopefully we will have a luxury that people will not still need to stay in military, at least so widely in military. And then, of course, we will have this need for dialogue between, I would say, like different Ukrainians. So Ukrainians who survived through occupation and different time of occupation, government and civil society, because we definitely will need to talk about the new societal agreement. So what kind of country, what kind of society we are, and how we will manage the existential risk for the future. And also, we will definitely need a dialogue between Ukrainians and other ethnicities who will hopefully come to Ukraine, because we also already experience quite acute demographic challenge and demographic crisis, actually. And we already have voices that we will need to attract people to come to work in Ukraine, to live in Ukraine, and then we as Ukrainian society need to reinvent ourselves after this war experience, and then build our connections with other ethnicities as well. So thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And right now, I think we shall further narrow the focus. You spoke about the different participants, different topics of possible dialogue. And right now, we shall give the floor to Josh Nadau, who will speak about the problems of the actual problems what have already emerged during past dialogues. And let me also tell you that, sorry, Josh is a Canadian dialogue facilitator and researcher. However, he's based in Tbilisi, Georgia, and he's affiliated with the Ottawa Dialogue, a Canadian NGO specializing in Track 2 diplomacy, and has experience working with both Ukrainian and Russian dialogue facilitators. So it will be a new feature of his presentation. And he also works with dialogue processes related to socio-political polarization in North America. Josh, I know that you are the last one, and this is the most difficult. Please try to shorten your presentation to save some time for discussion. Thank you very much. Sorry for this.
No problem. I definitely think that some of the other topics are certainly more complicated when we're talking about like official peace processes and inclusion and the impact of war. But today, like here, I want to talk about division within peace building communities, about how to relate to dialogue. So first, I want to say that I'm very honored to be here with my colleagues, and I'm very happy to see many familiar faces in the audience. And so many of us obviously are practitioners or who have been involved in or who support dialogue as a mechanism to respond to conflict and war. But supporting dialogue, as we've learned, especially over the past few years, isn't necessarily enough to actually go about doing the work that we want to do. So, for example, I'm making the assumption, and I hope that this is true, that the participants on this call are against Russia's invasion and aggression, and who want peace in Ukraine and in the broader region. But there's still an issue. Even among those who work towards peace, whether or not they formally work with peace-building organizations or contexts, often have a very different idea of peace. A peace for the different conflicts that they work in or that they're involved in, and what peace they want to work towards. And so this has led to conflict within among peace builders and among dialogue practitioners, to say nothing about the broader community of activists or other practitioners or other communities. And so what I want to talk about now is we're all here talking about the role that dialogue can play, but what about the people who are actually interested in doing the dialogues? Are we able to collaborate with each other? Are we able to manage the conflicts that we have between ourselves? And so these conflicts, I want to talk about what they look like and what impact they can have in the field. Also about some of the factors that are fueling the conflicts between practitioners, and what are some ways forward to help peace builders engage with each other with respect, concern, and care, and in ways that also open up like a way forward to work together in the context. And so this isn't like geographical. I'm not talking about Ukrainian peace builders. I'm talking about peace builders like in Ukraine, outside of Ukraine. How are we relating to each other, and are we successfully able to work with each other, and why or why not? So I obviously have some strong opinions about how I think peace should look like. There are some opinions that I have that are still being shaped, and so I don't want to talk about like what's right and what's wrong so much as about the conflicts that exist. And I'm speaking as a practitioner, I would say primarily, but some of the things that I'm talking about engages with research conducted by colleagues, including some of my Ukrainian co-speakers here. Where are these conflicts existing between practitioners? So obviously a lot of us, like, first off, it's like in our it was mentioned earlier about how we have different visions of peace and different ideas of peace. And many of us obviously want to have some kind of comprehensive, positive peace within the region where Ukraine and especially Russia are transformed into peaceful societies. But if that's the ideal, many of us promote like different ideas of what's the next best or what's most realistic, or people have different ways of talking about this. I'm going to list some of these different competing sometimes visions of peace. And they're not, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's kind of like a starting map that we can kind of look at. So there are approaches that have to do with negative peace or conflict resolution, where the emphasis is on de-escalating the conflict, limiting the loss of life, trying to cool things down, maybe not solving it entirely, but also, like, let's face it, some of these are also motivated by economic concerns. We all know that Trump is very interested in transactional deals. There are people who want the war to stop so that trade can continue. There are geopolitical concerns, for example. Some people want to stop worrying about war in Europe so that Trump can go think about China. So like these are all this kind of like de-escalation so that we can kind of do other stuff. There's also this idea, which was written about by Tatiana Kiselova, about peace through victory. Which is talking about how to restore and think about territorial integrity in Ukraine, questions of security, security guarantees so that the war doesn't start again, and also about justice. Also kind of in this nexus are general ideas about what is a just peace, how to stop Russia's aggression, and also kind of maintain the liberal order as it is. So like restore the boundary, like the borders of Ukraine to its internationally recognized space. Also, there are lots of prominent statements that have been released by Ukrainian civil society, like the Peace Appeal, also the Sustainable Peace Manifesto that are connected to this. But then there are anti-militarist visions of peace, which might be more open to concessions because they see militarization and militarism as the larger enemy. And some of these are also very dedicatedly pacifist, right? Then you have visions of peace that are state-based or anti-state-based. So some might try to have a peace in which like state institutions as they normally are maintained, while others might think less about state institutions and more or what state controls what territory, and more about what happens to the people living in affected areas. And then you have more like anti-imperialist or decolonial visions of peace, where there's this desire to make changes in Russia, to demilitarize it, maybe regime change, maybe break it down into smaller countries. There's again, lots of discourse, conversations, stuff written about this. And obviously these are not black and white categories. Most of us operate on some kind of spectrum between these different extremes. So there are like these different visions of peace. If you're going to be like working towards one or another kind, it can lead to conflict, because if you're wanting just to de-escalate, you might be in conflict with people who want a more just peace, right? Whereas like de-escalation is not enough, we need like a more substantial kind of change. Then you have, in addition to these different visions of peace, you also have different scales of focus. So for example, three that are talked about a lot is this broader geopolitical aspect of the conflict, which is like NATO and Western countries versus Russia. Then you have this national or decolonial lens, which is like Ukraine versus Russia. And then you have like more of a local context, where it's like talking about conflicts and tensions inside of Ukraine, which have already been spoken about, especially by Natalia, like different aspects of that. So maybe between Ukrainians, between citizens in the state, when people think about issues of corruption, it's all kind of within this context. So how do some of the conflicts between peace builders who focus on different scales and different visions of peace happen? Just as a couple examples, there was a peace summit that happened in Vienna in 2023, and it was organized by people who were really critical of NATO and really critical of militarization, so mostly along the left, right? And that came into conflict with Ukrainians and their allies who want to advocate for a more just peace, and saw that this peace summit wasn't like taking the idea of just peace seriously enough. Then we have kind of, as another example, divisions divisions between dialogue practitioners who have different ideas of what kind of dialogue we should be doing right now in the context of Ukraine. So you have, for example, there's some camps of practitioners who say we need Russian and Ukrainian dialogue right now. We need to already start building the foundation for positive peace in the future, for reconciliation, and that any dialogue is needed and it's necessary now. Then you have others who are saying that maybe some forms of dialogue are irresponsible right now, maybe not the best use of limited resources. Also that some forms of dialogue place a larger burden on Ukrainians than on Russians. And there's also different things that are written about this. Also an element of this conflict is maybe starting to work on positive peace right now might get in the way of building negative peace, especially security for people who really need security. And so this was an ongoing debate. And then as a third example, you have these Trump-led talks, which is where this kind of de-escalation, positive, like conflict management, looking for the best positive deal, which also comes into conflict with people who want this just peace, but also this more leftist, anti-militarist resistance against Western hegemony. Right. So there are lots of different ways that this has emerged, and this has affected our ability to work together and to design processes that are going to like help or maybe have an impact or like whatever we think our dialogues or that we desire our dialogues are going to do. And so there are lots of questions and issues that are motivating these conflicts. So, for example, some want to affirm values, work towards a peace that is more just than ideal, not to set a precedent, to reward Russia for the invasion. Versus concerns framed more as pragmatic or as realistic. You also have people who focus on the needs of like the globe, like supply chains, things are interrupted, versus the needs of like Ukrainians who are suffering on the ground. You have this like tension between centering the defending country in an act of aggression versus like addressing the wider region. So some people are like, let's also focus on Russia's security concerns, which is different than Russia's imperial ambitions, but there's a whole other conversation about that. And then you have, for example, like real security dangers and the defense needs in Ukraine, or also people who may want to fight or who don't want to fight, and like the human rights question that is aspect of that. And then you have people who are debating about what's going to cause more damage to Ukraine in the long run, concessions that might not be just, or ongoing armed resistance. And people have many different answers to these questions that I don't want to get into that debate right now, just that these debates exist, and these are some of the things that are motivating them. So as practitioners, what are some possible ways for us to have better conversations? These are just things that I found in my work, and also just hearing from people who have engaged in these kinds of conversations before. And there are kind of two things that I want to focus on in order to not take up too much more time. First is to define the scale that we want to work on. So again, we have this like geopolitical Russia, NATO, the West level, this like state like Russia, Ukraine, and like the local, and sometimes promoting peace that focuses on one level can seem to marginalize concerns that are at another level. And so it's like, okay, like I'm really concerned about like stopping nuclear war. Right. And like that's the most important thing. And but there might be somebody on a local level who says, OK, you're focused on like stopping nuclear war. But is that going to like make my life harder because I lived under occupation, or I don't want to fight, or like what have you. Right. And if there's a practitioner who only focuses on their scale, it might come off as my preferred peace matters and your legitimate needs don't matter, which is like very like frustrating to like say that very, very much is an understatement. So what does it mean to understand? Maybe we have a preference for scale that we just don't understand ourselves. So how do we understand what peace we're fighting for and at what scale, and like what we choose to prioritize? And does our preferred vision of peace and our scale have implications for others that we might not see or understand immediately? And how do we articulate in our conversations with other practitioners what our preference is and at what scale we're working on? And how can we do that explicitly so that other practitioners know what it is that we're motivated by, what we want to work for? And then coming into that is understanding the trade-offs, right? Because like if like obviously we want to have some kind of peace that like goes on like that impacts all of these levels, but like we're far from that. We're far from this positive peace that can include everything. And since like we don't have everything we want right now, we have to have some kind of trade-off. So for example, if we want to fight NATO expansion or militarization in Europe, and if we see that as like an enemy, how does this affect people living closer to Russia? Does our vision of peace make other people feel less secure? right? That's just like one example. And so we need to understand what are the trade-offs that we're asking other people to consider. And oftentimes the way that we're affected by these different trade-offs and compromises is going to be really affected by our positionality. And by positionality, I want to define it as just by saying not everyone is affected by the war equally. And this was something that Natalia has already said with these different groups inside of Ukraine. And because we're affected by the war differently, it's not just our opinions that are different, but our lived experience is different. It affects our minds, our bodies, our nervous systems in really different ways. Ukrainians' experience is different from non-Ukrainians. And as Natalia said, there are Ukrainians from regions close to the front, from Kiev, from the West, or in migration, and they all experience it differently. Non-Ukrainians like who live closer to Russia experience it differently from non-Ukrainians who live further away from Russia. And also we have practitioners who are pressured by their societies in ways that make it dangerous for them to speak honestly or without threats of violence to their persons. So, or if they spoke as honestly about the different nuances, there might be other people who sabotage their projects. And so we need to understand if someone if another practitioner can only speak publicly with limitations, and whether they'd be more open to discuss nuance in a more private, safe, and informal setting. Because the things that we hear our colleagues say might not be the whole story, because they might be in a less safe position than we are. So these questions aren't just in our heads. They're not just an intellectual matter. They're very much this like kind of embodied body experience. And we need to stop pretending that like bodies or trauma or fear don't exist. So for example, maybe we need spaces in both formal and informal processes where there's room for reflection, loss, mourning, rage, anger. Maybe we need to have spaces whenever we talk to colleagues where we have where people are able to express these emotions and express these different experiences. Maybe some of our colleagues need more time and more space to process what happens in our minds, bodies, and our hearts. And classical liberal peace-building approaches sometimes don't always properly account for this extra layer of reality that we all experience. So if I'm a practitioner who's less conflict affected, and if I'm working with someone who's more conflict affected, this isn't a question of being more patient with them, because that's really condescending, like framing it like that. But we're here to learn from experiences that aren't our own. And also, how can we treat these other experiences not as something just to get over, in order to do like the serious work of working on peace rationally or with a cool mind. Also, like if we are less conflict affected, and if we're less kind of divided and we have less complications in ourselves, maybe this is a form of privilege that we need to process and work through. And there's definitely some approach.
Sorry, Josh. Could you make it shorter? Just
great. I'm just at the end.
Sorry.
Perfect.
Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, and so we need to really kind of center these questions when we're working with our other colleagues to think about like, what are the asymmetries that are involved? How are we impacting different things? What does it mean to center conversations about peace and trade-offs around our positionality and around these asymmetries? Yeah, and I think that's it for me. It can be basically, the last thing I want to say is it can be disrespectful or offensive to present our vision of peace as if everyone's going to be affected by it equally, and that no one will be marginalized by our preferred vision of peace. We have to really, we really need to talk about this if we want to work together in a more constructive way. And I also see we're going to be starting questions very soon, and I see a lot of my Russian colleagues in attendance. And so I would just ask everyone not in the questions to start talking about the Russian context and the different problems that are there, because that would be taking space away from talking about Ukraine. And so we want to respect that space, I think, right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for your last words. And right now the floor is open for questions. Please try to formulate your question very shortly without making long comments. And then if you do have the question concretely to somebody, then please just name it to Natalia or to Josh or to any of the panelists. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Please, yes, raise your hands. And one more thing, because of the delay in the schedule, I would propose to postpone the conversation by, let's say, 15 minutes. And all those, of course, who will want to leave us, please feel free at any time. We shall continue. So go ahead. I don't see a raise hand. No question? Is it possible? No question? Steinar?
I think the presentations were very clear, and they were very kind of, in a way,
Unmute. No. Okay.
Now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes. No, I'm very glad I listened to this all these presentations. They were well documented. They had some kind of a self-explanatory consequences, and the clarity is really helping us to somehow, me as an outsider, understand some of this internal tensions. I very much like the way Natalia was somehow looking at all these different consequences, because often when we talk about war, we talk about the causes, and the causes are legitimate, the causes are justified, and that's why we have to keep fighting. But often causes can be justified and legitimate. The consequences for people are not, because the consequences are so destructive in their in the end. And let's say when we talk about collaborators, the main problem often is not the real collaborators, because we have a system, we have structures, they can be punished, but there is a lot of accusations of people that just because they maybe were living in the wrong village, maybe they just have the wrong name, maybe they just somehow had to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they end up being punished for much more than what they are somehow responsible for. And the rumors start. So in building a democratic state with equal rights, it's a challenge to somehow, how can we give everybody equal rights when some have been fighting so much more for this democratic state compared to some of the others? And this is not like a Ukrainian problem. This is a problem we see in all post-war societies. And of course, we saw it dramatically, after World War II. In my country and in many countries, how we were treating those we suspected were traitors. And not only them, also their children and their grandchildren. But I just wanted to say thank you to all the presenters, because it was very clear and to the point. And I didn't feel bad at all about some of you, taking your time, because these are also important issues, very important issues.
Okay, thank you very much. There are two questions here in the chat, and one is to Josh. This is about what are the general KPI in the dialogue with Russia, and please just give a short overview if it's possible, and then there will be another one to Tatiana Kiselyova and also Natalia Vesklibna. But let's start with Josh then. Josh, the floor is yours.
So as I mentioned in the comments, the issue of dialogue with Russia is huge, and like the KPIs and the indicators and the different elements of that is really depending on who you want to talk with, what impact you want to have, like what's your theory of change, and so to really discuss this question is a whole other thing. But there's been like lots of reflection and about this, and I've also participated in some sessions with Tatiana and some other practitioners. Hopefully there will be some kind of like publication or something more about this, because it's such an important question, and it really depends on what exactly you mean by dialogue with Russia, and it's impossible to give like a 2-minute answer because it's huge. I'm really sorry, but I left my email in the comments if you want to discuss further.
Okay,
I also invite my colleagues to answer.
No problem. I don't know whether anybody will want to add anything to that. I think the response of Josh was very, very reasonable. So probably we shall think about this with Steinar and also Harald to organize another event about this topic. but let's see it. So I ask first for the panelists. Do you want to add anything to this? If not, then let's go to the question to Tatiana and Natalia. The question is that Josh told about embodied trauma and embodied vision of peace and or safety. Do you have some data on this from your research and from your practice with different representatives of the Ukrainian society? So Natalia and Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Yeah, can I start?
Please go ahead.
Let me first give a quick reflection on Steiner's words, and I really enjoy being in the events with Steiner because his wisdom is huge, and thanks for sharing it with us. And this another dilemma, Josh, perhaps for your presentation about the focus of peace builders, either at the root cause or at the consequences of the conflict. And particularly in Ukraine, in the first period between 2014 and 2022, the focus of the OSCE process was very much on the consequences. They did absolutely great job. OSCE special mission did great job on bringing up voices of affected population and trying to ease their sufferings. But in the end of the day, the whole process, because it was focusing on consequences, really failed to prevent the large-scale invasion when you do not focus on root causes. So it's not, I think it's not either or, it's both, and we need to work simultaneously at all levels. And this brings us to this different levels of conflict, from geopolitical to bilateral and to intra-Ukrainian. And all of them have to be attended simultaneously. You can't do one or the other, and that's really adds to complexity of even thinking, not doing these things. Quick response on the Russian-Ukrainian dialogues. I did a lot of research. We brought together Ukrainian dialogue facilitators to reflect on those 10 years of Russian-Ukrainian dialogues. We've got a paper, and we have a lot of lessons, and connecting those lessons to the question on traumatic or embodied experiences. In those years preceding the large-scale invention, Ukrainians feel suppressed in the dialogue. That was the overall feeling, that while Russians were given the floor to tell whatever they want, Ukrainians were self-censoring themselves in those dialogues because of basically internationals, and not allowing. If you remember, there was a lot of violence towards Ukrainian at the so-called semantic level, when Ukrainians were prohibited to call this conflict a war. People have very short memories. Yeah, but up to 22, Ukrainians could not call this conflict a war. We were obliged by the vocabulary of OSCE to call it a conflict in and around Ukraine. And there was a lot of this unspoken violence against Ukrainians, and Ukrainian dialogue facilitation community has processed those lessons. We're ready to share, but that's definitely a topic for another conversation.
Thank you very much, Natalia.
I think Tatiana's answer was brilliant. I have nothing to add here. Thank you.
Excellent. Then my last question is: does anybody want to add anything to complement or to pose any question? If not, then my remaining task is first of all to say thank you for the excellent presentations. I think so that this is part of our mission to show, to demonstrate how complicated dialogue is, how difficult dialogue is. However, at the same time, dialogue is also very important to make peace, to facilitate reconciliation. And particularly, I think so that in Ukraine, even if the war, let's hope very soon, will be finished, there will be a lot of tasks for you, for practitioners in the field of dialogue. I am also, on behalf of my colleagues, appreciating that so many people have accepted our invitation, and this is already a very good core for future collaboration. Probably all of you are interested in dialogue, are interested in improving the situation in Ukraine, also partly, as I understood, between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And I think that together with Steinar and also with the others, we shall have to reflect on how to make use, how to capitalize on this community which we succeeded to collect, and what the further steps will be to do something maybe more concrete to facilitate dialogue in our circle, or at least in Ukraine, or between the Ukrainians and Russians. So I ask also my colleagues, Steinar, if you want to say some final thanks to the people or something, and if not, then Steinar, the floor is yours. I see you want to say something. Do you?
Well, no, I just want to add in the end that since I have to say, as Josh did, it's very nice to see quite a few people again that I haven't seen for some years, and to feel that you still have the strength and you have the capacity and you have the will, to keep fighting. This was an encouraging moment. When I was talking to you, let's say, particularly in the years after 2014, 15, 16, 17, I think my experience was based on long dialogues, because people would come to the Nansen Academy in Lillehammer for 3 months. And quite a few of those tensions you're talking about between people were very visible and also very obvious. So you can say that we had kind of a month to work through those different visions, understandings, interests, to get also on that level of having a relationship where the dialogue could become more constructive. Today, I think it would almost be impossible to gather people for 3 months. It's something that has happened with our very notion of time, TTT, things take time. We have maybe a week, we have 2 weeks, and we can just somehow open the box and not go deeper into all this. I just wanted to tell you that the last year I've been very involved in, is it possible to strengthen folk high school idea in Ukraine, working with the Ukrainian Bildung movement. And it is kind of exciting because the folk high school has that living environment. It has the place where people literally can come together over time. And one of my colleagues, Carl Plesner, he has the vision of even a folk high school for war veterans. And this sounds kind of, like a small thing. But in Norway, we have the Nansen program, which is a very solid program to support civil society in the future. And we are communicating with them. And of course, the Nansen program should be obliged to support Nansen dialogue. And feel free to contact me and let us discuss potential initiatives, and also know that you're always welcome to the Nansen Academy in Lillehammer with a group, with people to come. And so I look forward to see all of you in the future.
Thank you very much, Steinar. And I, on behalf of all of us, three of us, and also Christina, who was the co-hosting partner of ours, my right hand. Thank you very much for your collaboration. And I wanted to say that let's try to see each other soon to speak about the next steps. And thank you again. Nice day, nice evening, depending where are you now. And enjoy the day and also the night if you are there. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.